A certificate is a credential, or at least it is kind of a credential. It's sort of your identity, but not really. And it's signed by someone everyone trusts, at least maybe. It's definitely not the same as a public key. Remember public key cryptography? Alice uses public key cryptography to digitally sign things. She signs documents with her private key and sends the signed document to Bob. Bob needs Alice's public key to verify the signature. Where does he get it and how is he sure it's Alice's? Certificates were the solution. A certificate is a binding between a public key and an identity. A mutually trusted entity takes Alice's name and Alice's public key, sticks them together, and then signs the whole mess. Now Bob has no worries. He gets Alice's public key certificate from somewhere and verifies the signature on it. The key is that Bob trusts the signer, called a certificate authority. So problem solved, the world is now safe for electronic commerce. Well, not exactly. Note that we haven't actually solved the problem. All we've done is taken the original problem, how does Bob know that Alice's public key is really hers, and changed it to, how does Bob know that signer's public key is really his. Bob has to verify the signer's signature on the certificate before he can use Alice's key, so he needs the signer's public key. And where is he going to get that? But we did solve something. Bob presumably wants to communicate with a lot of people, not just with Alice. And if the signer has signed everyone's certificate, we've reduced Bob's problem from verifying everyone's public key to verifying just one public key. A real certificate is a little more complicated. It contains information about the person, his name, possibly his job title, possibly his email address, and other things about him, along with information about the certificate, when it was issued, when it expires, and information about the issuer or signer, and information about the public key, as well as some information about the public key itself. The basic idea is that Alice gets a public key certificate signed by God somehow. Either she generates her own public key, private key pair, and sends the public key to God, who returns the public key certificate. Or God generates a public key, private key pair for Alice and sends her both the private key and the public key certificate. Now we have the problem of securing this exchange, but never mind that for now. This all works great until Alice loses her private key. Maybe someone stole it. Maybe she just forgot it. Or, more likely, her computer crashed and didn't have a backup. Bob is going to try to send her encrypted email in that lost key. Or, worse yet, Bob is going to try to verify signatures created after someone stole the key. What do we do now? Well, we can tell God, and he revokes Alice's certificate. He declares it no longer valid, no longer good, no longer correct. How does he do this? He can't go through every nook and cranny of the net and erase every copy of the certificate. He probably doesn't even know Bob has a copy of it. So God puts Alice's certificate on the certificate revocation list, or CRL. The certificate revocation list is a list of revoked certificates. God issues a certificate revocation list at regular intervals, and it is Bob's job to make sure that Alice's certificate is not on the current certificate revocation list before he uses it. He should also make sure that it hasn't expired and that the certificate really does belong to Alice. How does Bob do that last one? He compares Alice's name with the name on the certificate. If they match, then the certificate is hers. It sounds simple, except that it doesn't work. So why is this problematic? The idea has several problems, actually. First, there is no one to act as God. Or, more properly, there is no one organization or entity that everyone can agree on and whose judgment is unassailable. The second is that Alice has no single name that everyone can agree on. So for this whole system to work, Alice has to have her certificate issued by someone that both she and Bob trust. In reality, we use hierarchies of trust to establish the validity of certificates. A military organization is probably the best example of this. The platoon leader signs the certificates of everyone in his platoon. The division commander signs the certificate of every platoon leader under him. The army general signs the certificates of his divisional commanders, and so on up to the commander-in-chief. Alice now has a chain of certificates, from the commander-in-chief to the army general to the divisional commander to the platoon leader to her. She keeps them all and presents them to Bob. If she and Bob are in the same platoon, then Bob also has the platoon leader's certificate. He knows that it is valid, so he can verify Alice's certificate directly. If Bob is in the same division as Alice but in a different platoon, they share the same divisional commander certificate. Bob can use it to verify Alice's platoon leader's certificate and then Alice's certificate. Since Alice and Bob are in the same military, someone is in both of their chains of command. It might even be the commander-in-chief, who is God in this example. This system works great in the military but less well in the civilian world. The internet uses certificates to fuel a lot of protocols, virtual tunneling systems, SSL, a few electronic commerce protocols, and some login protocols. These certificates are issued to users by someone called a certificate authority. A certificate authority can be a corporate security office, it can be a government, it can be a private company that is in the business of issuing certificates to internet users. These certificate authorities also need certificates. Remember, there's a hierarchy here. These certificate authority certificates are issued by other certificate authorities, probably very sign. Eventually you get to the god in this system, or in reality a pantheon of gods. The highest level certificate authorities have what are known as root certificates. They are no longer signed by anyone else. These certificates are embedded in the software you buy, your browser, your VPN software, and so forth. All of this is what is known as the public key infrastructure, PKI. It does work, but only sort of. Let's get back to the second problem, Alice's name. Back in ancient times, someone dreamed about a world where every individual, every process, every computer, every communications device, generally speaking anything connected to digital communications, had a unique name. These names would be held in a vast distributed database held by multiple people in multiple locations. This was called X500. Certificates generally associate a public key with a unique name called a distinguished name in X500 talk, but few people talk about how useful that association is. Imagine that you received a certificate belonging to Joan Robinson. You may know only one Joan Robinson personally, but how many does the certificate authority know? How do you find out if the particular Joan Robinson certificate you received is your friend's certificate? You could have received her public key in person or verified it in person, but more likely you received a certificate in email and are simply trusting that it is the correct Joan Robinson. The certificate's common name will probably be extended with some other information in order to make it unique among names issued by that one certificate authority. So, do you know that other information about your friend? Do you know what certificate authority her certificate should come from? Remember the phone directory metaphor for public keys. If you wanted to find Joan Robinson's public key, you would look her up in the directory, get her public key, and send her a message for her eyes only using that public key. This might have worked in a rural area with phone directory from 1976, but how many Joan Robinsons are in the New York City phone book, much less in a hypothetical phone book for the global internet? We grow up in small families where names work as identifiers. By the time we're 5 years old, we all learn this lesson. Names work in a small group or community. That is false in the bigger world, but things we learn as toddlers we never forget. In this case, we need to think carefully about names and not blindly accept their value by the 5-year-old's lessons locked into our memories. Also, what does it mean when a certificate authority claims that it is trustworthy? In the cryptographic literature, this only means that it handles its own private keys well. This doesn't mean you can necessarily trust a certificate from that certificate authority for a particular purpose. Who exactly gave the certificate authority the authority to grant such authorizations? Who made it trusted? Many certificate authorities sidestep the question of having no authority to delegate authorizations by issuing identity certificates. Anyone can assign names. In fact, humans do that all the time. This leaves the risk in the hands of the verifier of the certificate if he uses an identity certificate as if it implied some kind of authorization. Basically, certificates only protect you from those that the PKI vendor refuses to do business with. Some certificate authorities, in response to the fact that they are not authorities on the certificate contents, have created a two-part certification structure. A registration authority run by the authority on the contents. The idea is that the registration authority is responsible for validating what's in the certificate, and the certificate authority is responsible for issuing it. Then, yet another problem involves the protection of the private key. For the whole digital signature system to work, you have to be sure that only you know your private key. So then, how do you protect it? You almost certainly don't own a secure computing system with physical access controls. It can be attacked by viruses and other malicious programs. This matters mostly because of the term non-repudiation. The digital signature algorithm is not breakable, so a third party cannot forge your signature. If your signing key has been certified by an approved certificate authority, then you are responsible for whatever that private key does. It does not matter who was at the computer keyboard or what virus did the signing, you are ultimately responsible for actions done by your computer. There are similar vulnerabilities in the computer that does the verification. Certificate verification does not use a secret key, only public keys. But to verify a certificate, you need one or more root public keys, the public keys of one of the certificate authorities. If the attacker could add his own public key to that list, then he can issue his own certificates, which will be treated exactly like the legitimate certificates. They can even match legitimate certificates in every other field except that they would contain a public key of the attacker instead of the correct one. Certificates aren't like some magic security elixir where you can just add a drop to your system and it will become secure. For example, how is key lifetime computed? Does the vendor use 1 year just because that's common? A key should have a cryptographic lifetime, but it's up to security engineers to figure out what number that should be. Most people's only interaction with a PKI is using SSL. SSL secures web transactions, and sometimes PKI vendors point to it as enabling technology for electronic commerce. SSL does encrypt credit card transactions on the internet, but it is not the source of security for the participants. That security comes from credit card company procedures, allowing a consumer to repudiate any line item charged before paying the bill. SSL protects the consumer from eavesdroppers. It does not protect against someone breaking into the website and stealing a file full of credit card numbers, nor does it protect against a rogue employee at the merchant harvesting credit card numbers.